Women took to the streets in some 40 cities in Iran this month after the tragic death of a young woman named Mahsa Amini, who was detained by the so-called morality police. And women around the world have added their voices since, turning out for demonstrations by the thousands in solidarity. What happens next could be momentous or crushing. With us for their views, in New Delhi, India, Ramin Jahanbegloo, Director, Mahatma Gandhi Center on Nonviolence and Peace. In Waterloo, Ontario, Besma Momani, Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo and Senior Fellow at CG, the Center for International Governance and Innovation. And here in our studio, Haide Mogisi, Emerita Professor and Trudeau Fellow at York University. Hello to you all.
Hello.
This is a somber conversation, but a very important conversation. And Haide, I wanted to start with you because when we were talking before we started taping, I asked you what this moment feels like for you, and you said that it was exciting but painful. What did you mean by that?
I mean that it's very exciting, elating, I would say, watching what's happening in the streets of Tehran. This is really unbelievable uprising like no others that we have had many of them in the last decade or so in Iran, but this one is quite unique in terms of not only the composition of the protesters on the streets, but on some of the initiatives and particularly the slogan, women, life, freedom, Zan, Zendegi, Azadi, that they are using, and it has become the motto of the protesters nationwide.
You mentioned that one of the rallying calls is woman, life, freedom. Besma, what is the latest that you're hearing about the protests?
Well, they're certainly continuing, and there's already reports of arrests of perhaps 1,200. That's sort of what's known. It maybe even is more than that. The protests are across the entire country. Very interesting. It perhaps started off maybe in the Northwest, but it's really spread into all parts of the country. And the composition of the protesters themselves is far more diverse. It started off perhaps with more of a women focus, but it's increasingly become very much a wide mass protest movement. There is a lot of fear, palpable fear, I'm sure, partly because I think even today we've heard, the President Raisi come out saying that, this sort of chaos, quote unquote, won't be accepted. That's a precursor to the kind of, things that Heidi was mentioning that really is going to be before us. So the crackdown is imminent. I don't think we can ignore that. The internet keeps getting throttled. Evening hours are really the time that they've tried to turn off the internet as much as possible. In fact, I think we're seeing from the diaspora communities getting less and less contact with their family members, and certainly there's less and less videos coming out of Iran, which really does portend a very, I think, scary prognosis, which is that the government really is preparing for that crackdown.
Ramin, Besma mentioned that, the internet has been cut off and on, and it's hard to get information out of the country. Let's go back to how this all started. What started these protests?
Well, what started these protests was, as we know, the killing of Mahsa Amini, a woman who was actually protesting somehow against mandatory wearing of the hijab, but I think that mostly what started it was also the fact that there has been a generation change, and we cannot compare today's protests with what happened in Iran in 2009 or in 2019, for the good reason that these protests that we see today, they are very spontaneous. They do not have a defined political leadership, and they have no ideology. Now, in 2009, it was practically, the millions of Iranians came out to protest against a fraudulent election, but it meant that they wanted to vote, and it was headed by two reformists of the Islamic Republic. This is not the case anymore. Actually, we see that in today's Iran, there is no fear among especially the younger women, but also young men. And this fear which existed for their parents and grandparents, I would say, for a long time, has been transformed into a kind of anger. And what was a dream for the parents and grandparents has become reality for them.
I want to come back to what you just said. What was a dream for the grandparents has become a reality for the young people now. But Besma, I just wanted to talk a bit more of how this started. And this was after the death of Mahsa Amini, also known as Gina, a 22-year-old who was stopped by the morality police. Who is the morality police, Besma?
Well, unfortunately, it's as it sounds. It's a police force and really equipped as such to roam much of the streets to look for people who, in their view, are not following the moral code. And in this case, it's usually mostly women, although certainly some men have also been stopped by the morality police, not to suggest that they're not. But people who don't follow the attire, who may be showing public expressions of affections, particularly people that are not their, their partners, all of that kind of repression that one would find in these situations. I think a context I wanted to just mention about Mahsa, of course, she comes from a Kurdish region. She is from an ethnic minority. And so this did, and not to suggest that there is, there's certainly grievances amongst the Kurdish community and certainly grievances amongst other ethnic communities in Iran for how they are treated by the regime. But there's still not clarity as to whether or not she was targeted for her Kurdish identity. Perhaps she had an accent. She's not from Tehran. She was coming to Tehran to visit family and was again spotted by the morality police. And the morality police, I'll just point out as well, they have their ebbs and flows in terms of when they've really turned on the pressure. And the context here is really important because, in fact, the morality police have, I'd say, doubled down in the past few years, and even more so since the current president has come to power last year. And that's really the important context here. As Ramin noted that, there is no fear, but increasingly I find that, the Iranians have less and less hope in the sense of things changing inside the country. I mean, they're hopeful about this movement as being a revolutionary one, but there's less and less hope that things are going to get better. And in some ways, some of the previous protests, you could kind of perhaps point to a few things, some potential silver linings, and we talked about reformists in government, but this is a doubling down of the fundamentalists back now in power. Raisi pretty much rigged the entire election to ensure his coming to power. There's signs that he may even be the one that's now going to become the supreme leader. I mean, this is a political context that's getting worse and worse by the day. So yes, there's no fear, but partly there's no fear because there's no hope. The hope of things getting better in Iran is fading by the moment. And unfortunately, that's what makes these protests very different, in my view, than the previous ones, because at least maybe there was hope, although I think many would argue that the entire Islamic Republic had no hope of succeeding by the very nature of the way it was constituted. But this president, this government coming to power, and the prospects for seeing no change from the reformists is really adding, I think, the fuel to the fire.
Haide, Besma mentioned that there is no hope, but before Ramin mentioned that this was the grandparents' dream, but it's becoming a reality. On March 7th, 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini announced that all women must wear hijab. You were there, so you're connected to this in a different kind of way. Can you tell us about your personal story?
Yes, I would definitely love to do that. But before actually that, I want to add something in terms of what Ramin and Basma said. And that is the most remarkable aspect of this uprising is not only, the militancy and the differences that Basma actually counted, but the very fact that women started this uprising and women are leading this uprising. So this is something that, not only this one, but also the very fact that the young men and old, whoever is on the streets, they are accepting not only the leadership of the women, but also using the slogan, the motto, women, life, freedom. I mean, this is really a movement of importance, not only for Iran. I would say it has a global caliber, as we see from the enormous support that they are getting from Turkey to Syria to the Western countries. So many artists, so many musicians, so many celebrities, so to speak, come out, make clippings and send statements of support, because many people feel affinity with this slogan. So this is the most remarkable aspect of this. And in terms of the arrests that are being made, let's not forget that it's not only the protesters that the government is actually cracking down on. Right now, we have information that over 20 journalists and photojournalists have been arrested, some lawyers, but particularly I want to mention the name of Nilufar Hamedi, the woman who was the first one who went to the hospital and reported on the state of affairs, and they took a photograph of this Mahsa. And that was that is what ignited the whole
You sound more
movement.
hopeful, but she's been arrested, that journalist.
That's it. That's why that I'm saying that particularly this woman, that immediately they arrested and along with her colleagues. So, these are some of the aspects of this uprising that is, in my view, they are much more important than some of the political, backgrounds and foundations of this protest.
Well, tell us about your experience in 1979.
Yes, you mentioned that on the eve of International Women's Day, March 8th, there were actually statements, advertisements about a rally that was being organized by women on the occasion of International Women's Day. And Ayatollah Khomeini chose that particular night actually to announce that women should cover up. And it is quite funny because he mentioned that women are going to offices and to places naked. And one of our renowned historians, Homa Nater, late Homa Nater, who spoke to the media, said that, come on, this is winter. How could women go to the offices naked? Making, a joke somehow of this statement. In any case, we went to the rallying place, but women were not in a mood to sit down and listen to lectures. So poured on the streets, and basically we were there for the whole day, and we were pressured from both sides by the Hezbollahis, the tags, and the regime suppressive apparatuses. I myself, actually, at those days, they wouldn't shoot at women. That was the beginning of the revolution. But they were pushing us from both sides. I myself my neck was hurt, actually, and was in neck brace for 40 days. But, at that point, the regime retreated because, they were shocked by this response by women from all walks of life. But it took about a year after the separation of all political parties, all organizations, all, decent, and then they made mandatory hijab legal. And the women who were defying hijab were subjected to beating and fines and arrests. And then, 43 years that women have lived under this terror.
You mentioned that at the time that they didn't harm women, maybe some pushing and shoving. We're seeing images of rubber bullets being used, and we know there's unconfirmed reports of how many people have died. And Ramin, you felt the consequences of the regime. You were imprisoned in Iran. What happened?
Well, I think it's going to prison in Iran is a very difficult matter. because actually they keep especially in the confinement, in solitary confinement, and I was in solitary confinement for 125 days. Of course, prisoners cannot see each other. Some of them are like myself, were intellectuals or civic actors. Some of them were more engaged in ethnic groups or in political parties. But I want to come back to what Heidi said and to relate it to what you've been asking me. Actually, it's all about the nature of the evil in the Iranian regime. I think that our viewers will understand much better what is the nature of the Iranian regime if I tell them that Iranian regime is a mixture of the Spanish Inquisition and Al Capone, the organized crime, because you have a lot of corruption, you have a lot of violence. Actually, it's inherent in the nature, political nature of the Iranian regime to be violent. Now, this violence for 43 years has targeted women, especially. And why women? Because, especially younger women, because younger Iranian women are beautiful, they are well dressed, they put perfumes on themselves, they are clever, they are 70% of the entrance in the exams, entrance exams for the universities. So everything that people who hate women and they are against them in this regime, they don't want to have. They don't want them to have. So that's why they've been harnessing, actually violating the human rights of women, the women's rights, and this is why I think that women have been the target of the Iranian regime for 43 years. I mean, this is not the first time that a woman is killed in custody. Actually, one of the women who was killed in custody, we have to remind our viewers, was Zahra Kazemi, who was an Iranian Canadian, as you know, photographer. So this killing has been going for a long period of time of killing of women. But this time, I think with this generation, they said enough is enough. And actually, because they have become fearless, and because they have grown up with a parallel, I would say, life of information through the internet, through Twitter, through YouTube, through a lot of fake Telegram, they made their own world, which was completely absent, I would say, in the beginnings of the revolution. And now we can see that how they don't care about only economic mismanagement or the nuclear deal. What they care about is that the regime has to go, and they don't want that. So I'm not saying that democracy is around the corner, actually, but I'm sure that this is a point of no return for the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Heidi, I know you want to come in on this, but I want to go to Besma really quickly. Besma, we know that women in Iran are extremely educated. A majority of them are in STEM. And we've seen on social media women around the world cutting their hair in solidarity. There's a Turkish singer who cut her hair off on stage afterwards. And I know when these things happen, there's a tendency for women from other parts of the world not hijacking, but maybe inserting themselves in what's happening and not fully understanding the context, as you were talking about before. So how have these protests changed global conversations around feminism?
Yeah, and look, I mean, I think there's, of course, benefit for the global feminist movement to be inspired by the Iranian women. And of course, they all share a common core message of the fact that women have a right to have agency over their own body. And certainly that is something that resonates. But I think it's really important for particularly Western feminists not to intercede in the conversation or to really make this about them. You know, unfortunately, we saw some ill-timed commentary that came out of particularly some political women in the United States talking about how this is really related to the abortion laws in the United States and so forth. And again, that's not to take away from that a very important debate. But I think the Iranian women really want solidarity with their movement. The pressure that Iranian women have is different. There isn't morality police roaming in the United States in the same way that you found in Iran. This is a very unique context. And Iranian women have suffered. They are the ire of the morality police often, and are the ones that have really suffered greatly. And as Ramin noted, they are highly, highly intelligent. Again, I can't express how lucky Canada is, and the United States in particular, as being the beneficiary of the enormous brain drain coming out of Iran. We are the beneficiary of all these talented people, including the two colleagues on this panel. This is really the sad reality of Iran. The folks, people there have really lost hope and really just want to migrate, want to leave. As a professor in a STEM-based university, I can tell you we are, again, the beneficiary of all this great talent. But I can't tell you the amount of emails that I get from Iranians almost daily, and I'm sure a lot of my colleagues across this country share the sentiment of wanting to get out. Brilliant, brilliant people. I think this is what is really so sad, because one knows that the potential of this country is so great, if only it wasn't ruined by this mafia, as Ramin pointed out. Not only are they corrupt morally, in my view, in terms of their imposition of a theocracy, but they're also just embedded in the entire economic structure. So not only are they political, morally corrupt, they're also economically corrupt, and that, again, takes away that hope. And so this culmination of all that is really what we see today. And I'm really so impressed by Iranian women. They really have been impressive before this movement, and I think yet again. And there's so many great Iranian icons of many previous protest movements as well. Mahsa will go down with so many other enormously talented women who have been, unfortunately, been the ire of the state and have really paid the ultimate price.
I wanted just to add to what Ramin said about, the praise that he has for Iranian women, rightly so. But I want also add the resistance of women throughout these 43 years. The women started, the protest against Ayatollah's mandatory hijab, but they never stopped fighting for their rights. Sometimes for legal reforms in the family law, for example, very quietly, and sometimes very loudly. Some very prominent Iranians who, resorted to self-burning in protest, and many other forms, for example, the campaign on 1 million IMZA signature, and many other forms that women have actually adopted to say no to the policies of Islamification by this regime. So this resistance should be recognized and should be respected. And I think one of the reasons that this slogan, women, life, freedom, is adopted by everyone is out of sense of recognition of women's both suffering and resilience and resistance throughout these years. That's why, overwhelming majority of people in Iran right now, being on the streets or not, they recognize this fact. And they recognize the fact that if they want democracy and freedom, there is no way that they can achieve it without recognizing and working for the gender democracy and freedom in the country. So it is very important. And the affinity that the young people, actually, the young men feel about all these facts that was mentioned. Right now, we have information and the clippings that university students, male university students in protest have started shaving their heads, in public, cutting their hair. This is remarkable aspects of this uprising.
Would you call this a revolution?
Revolutions happen when people at the bottom actually feel that they can't take it anymore. They are fed up. And those on the top feel problems in terms of cracks within their own ranks, or out of exhaustion after all, it is exhausting the way they are suppressing people. And that's when revolutions happen. I wouldn't necessarily call this movement or uprising a revolution, but definitely this is the most remarkable event that has happened in Iran. Yes, Iran has seen many, many revolutions, I would say, at least 3 major revolutions in the past since 1905, and many movements, but nothing like this. And I would really give credit mostly to Iranian women, young and old, who have fought all through these 43 years with everything that has been at their disposal. And also, I want to mention, that by saying this, I'm not reducing what's happening in Iran right only to the question of hijab and women's demands for their rights. Iran's economy is in deep crisis right now. I mean, forget about the corruption, forget about, the abuse of power, but economic matters are very, very important for the lives of people. These young people who are on the streets, for example, have been denigrated, insulted. You wouldn't believe, some of the excuses that this regime has for ridiculous things that they demand of these youth in Iran. Like, for example, not even wearing sunglasses or being arrested, questioned or insulted by having short sleeve shirts, so on and so forth. And add this to the rampant unemployment for youth is now, according to International Labour Organization, 27%. I mean, the inflation that is 50%, and for some items, 80%. So these are very important, facts and important reasons for these uprisings. But of course, Mahsa's murder, cold-blooded murder, triggered these uprisings.
Besma, Haide mentioned all the economic strife that's happening in the country. We know that the supreme leader is 83 years old. The Iranian government doesn't report, and the state media, they don't report on his health, but they have been unverified reports saying that he recently had a health scare. How does his age factor into the protests and what's happening right now?
I mean, it's a factor. I mean, Iran is run by geriatrics. That's the sad part. I mean, there's just, so many people who are so out of touch with the young people on the street, and that only adds to the frustration furthermore. In terms of the supreme leader, we've been hearing about his ailments and, his eventual death for so long now. I think people are even fed up of that conversation internally. Of course, what makes it worse, too, is that Raisi that's the current president, who is a real hardliner and has enormous blood on his hand from years past and, crushing political protesters in 1988 and throughout. He has been, people think, perhaps being the one that's going to be chosen as the next supreme leader. And this is really, I think, part of his rationale that he's, in fact, doubling down, trying to prove his fundamentalist credentials to the other ayatollahs. And this is even scarier prospect. That's what I mean about, even less and less hope for change. As I alluded to, at some point there was hope that perhaps some reformers, and I put that in quotation marks because I think a lot of people still think that they're very objectionable in many ways. But, that maybe was opening up some level of hope that there could be some change along the margins. But that's been shut down. And that's what's really, I think, important here, because if the supreme leader does die imminently and he is replaced by another hardliner, which I think is, you can just see it, it's in the cards, and the government has been completely stacked with hardliners, there's just no hope for that, again, change at the margins. And that's not to satisfy, again, that's not going to be satisfactory to the vast majority of Iranians. They don't want change at the margins. They want wholesale overthrow and change it completely, because it is rotten to the core. But again, that context is really important. I think it's really adding more to the fuel to the fire, as I said.
I mean, we have about 30 seconds left, but do you see the government making any concessions around what's happening right now in Iran?
I think that, first of all, the supreme leader is already dead in the mind of most of the Iranians. So I think the matter is that the Iranian regime cannot continue in the same path, and I think that it's the future is very uncertain for the Islamic Republic, and especially because of the people. Actually, I think that in a couple of weeks we will see the working class already. The teachers and the universities have joined the youngsters, and we might have also the truck drivers. We might have also other parts of the population. So if that happens, actually, I think it's going to be really very difficult for the Iranian regime to keep itself all together.
I really appreciate all of your time and helping us understand this issue better. And Ramin and Haideh, it's not easy to share memories of dark times, and we appreciate you doing that tonight with us. Thank you so much,
Pleasure.
everybody. Appreciate it.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.